It was the 4th of July, but the sky over our family ranch in western Illinois felt heavy, like even the fireworks didn't dare interrupt what was coming. My name is Cassandra Knox. I'm 33 years old, and as of 3 nights ago, I hold the rank of Major General in the United States Military, Strategic Division. First in my field. Youngest on record. But none of that mattered here. Out by the barn, someone had set up speakers playing country classics, the kind my father always claimed represented real America. Kids chased each other around bales of hay, while adults sipped cheap bourbon and bragged about things they didn't understand. My mother wore her favorite blue apron and served baked beans with a forced smile. I stood on the edge of it all, boots, dusty hands, clean back straight, and waited for what I knew would come. Gregory, my older brother, was wearing his navy whites, like a movie prop. He smiled too much, drank too little, and soaked in the admiration like it was his due. He was everything this family had ever wanted. I was tolerated. Then came the toast. My father rose with his glass raised high, sweat glistening on his temples, voice already half slurred. To my son he bellowed Commander Gregory Knox, for carrying the Knox name with pride and honor. People clapped. Too loud, too eager. And my daughter, he added. Not looking at me. Well, her choices are her own. A few chuckles. A couple of glasses lowered awkwardly. I didn't flinch. I'd prepared for this. But then the TV mounted on the porch flickered. The baseball game faded. A breaking news banner rolled across the bottom of the screen. The anchor's voice cut into the air like a scalpel. We've just received confirmation from the Department of Defense. My face appeared on screen in uniform beneath the headline, 33-year-old strategist, appointed Major General, the mind behind Operation Sentinel. Silence. Utter silence. Even the wind stopped moving. My father's hand trembled. His bourbon sloshed. But no one turned to me, not a word, not even my name. Just the sound of America clapping for me on TV. While my own family looked the other way. I was born on a Thursday in a county hospital that smelled like bleach and overcooked peas. My mother later told me she almost named me after a flower lily or iris, but my father said no daughter of his would grow up soft. So I became Cassandra. Biblical, stern, ominous. Gregory was 4 when I arrived. Blonde, blue-eyed, built like a golden retriever even as a toddler. He had already taken up space on the mantle in the photo albums and in every plan my father made about legacy. I was a disruption, at least that's what it always felt like. We grew up on a cattle farm just outside of Clayton, Illinois. Our father, Jackson Knox, ran the place like a private platoon. Rise at 500 chores before school, no backtalk. He was a veteran, but not a decorated one, served 2 tours in logistics, and spent the next 30 years reminding everyone about it. The rules of the Knox house were simple. Gregory led, Cassandra followed. And if I asked why, the answer was always the same, because you're not him. When I was 6, I beat Gregory at a spelling bee. He cried. My father scolded me for embarrassing him. When I was 10, I won first place in the regional science fair. The photo my mom took stayed in the drawer. The same day Gregory hit a double at Little League. His picture made the fridge. At 13, I made varsity track as a freshman. Dad didn't come to the meet. He was at a Rotary Club dinner. Gregory was receiving a Young Leader Award. It became easier not to share my victories. Not because I stopped achieving, but because I stopped expecting applause. I learned to clap for myself quietly, alone. High school passed like a storm you sleep through. I stayed busy. Straight A's, dual enrollment classes, debate captain. I even got into West Point, but turned it down in favor of a full scholarship ROTC program at Purdue. Cheaper for the family, I reasoned. I told myself it was a noble choice, but deep down, I think I just wanted less room for disappointment. At my ROTC commissioning ceremony, I looked for my parents in the crowd. They were there, sitting stiff in the 3rd row, already checking their watches. Gregory had flown in just for the day, wearing his Naval Academy pin, like a badge of superiority. He gave me a one-armed hug and whispered, "Make sure you don't trip on stage." I didn't. I walked across that stage in heels that blistered with a spine straighter than any salute, and shook the hand of the colonel who'd once told me I had too much steel for a girl. I didn't smile for the cameras. I saved my smile for the moment I stepped outside alone and looked up at the sky like it owed me something. The military at first didn't feel much different than my family. Men called me ma'am with a curl of sarcasm. Some saw my intelligence as ambition, others as threat. But unlike home, I had rank here, and eventually respect followed. My first assignment was at Fort Carson, Colorado. The barracks were freezing in the winter, and the coffee was always burnt. But I made it work. I showed up early, stayed late, memorized every protocol, anticipated questions before they were asked. Slowly the noise faded. I became Knox to my unit, no more, no less. The first time my parents visited was because Gregory had a layover in Denver. They stayed at a Marriott 30 minutes from base and invited me to dinner. I took them to a modest steakhouse, popular with the locals. My mother pushed peas around her plate and said nothing about my new position. My father ordered scotch and spent 20 minutes talking to the waiter about Gregory's Navy career. I excused myself before dessert and paid the check before they could offer. Back at the barracks, I sat on my bunk and stared at the pair of boots lined up by the door. Polished, predictable, like me. There was a quiet moment that night when I wondered what it would feel like to just stop trying. But I didn't, because even if they never saw me, the world eventually would. Even if my name was whispered only in briefings. Even if no one clapped at my ceremonies. Even if I stood in the shadows of every family photo, there would come a day where silence could no longer hide what I'd become. I folded my uniform shirt and set it on the chair. Then I opened my laptop and submitted the application for Special Intelligence Officer selection. It was the first decision I made without wondering what my family would think. And for the first time, the weight of their absence felt like relief. Fort Carson was never home, but it was the first place I wasn't actively erased. The snow there didn't care about your last name. The wind didn't bend for medals. We all wore the same fatigues, ate the same rubbery eggs, and filled the same sandbags and drills. That kind of equality, gritty, unspoken, was the only thing that felt close to love. I made specialist in under a year. Not because I was favored, but because I was meticulous. By then I had learned how to listen in meetings without speaking too fast, how to predict the shift in tone before the sergeant's voice dropped. I was studying not just tactics, but people, patterns, gaps, weak points. Still, I kept one habit from childhood. Every month, like a tithe, I sent money home. It started as $100 from my first real check, then $200, then $300 once I started picking up hazard assignments and side briefings. I told myself it was for the old house in Clayton, maybe new storm windows, maybe to help Mom fix the porch swing that had cracked in half one summer and never been replaced. I never asked what the money was used for. I didn't want to know. But I imagined her using it for groceries. I imagined my father letting it sit in the account without comment. I imagined some invisible point tally rising with every wire transfer proof that I was still trying. At night, I'd heat instant noodles in the common room microwave, sip black coffee, and ignore the way the others planned weekend trips or ordered takeout. I stayed behind telling myself the sacrifice mattered. When the holidays came, I booked the cheapest flight and skipped Thanksgiving dinner with my squad to go back home. I brought a pie, a homemade one, cherry. My mother smiled tightly when she opened the door. She looked older, or maybe just distant. My father was already halfway through a football game shouting at the screen. Gregory wasn't home. He was networking in D.C., my mother said. I stayed 2 days. They didn't ask much about the Army. No one mentioned the money. No one even touched the pie. I flew back with a hollow chest and a Tupperware of untouched leftovers. Then one Sunday afternoon, the phone rang. I was folding socks in the laundry room, the barracks quiet. I let it go to voicemail, but the notification buzzed again. Mom. I picked up the second time. Her voice was rushed bright. Honey, thank you so much for the last deposit. You won't believe how amazing Gregory looked in that Armani suit, I blinked. What the conference in Manhattan, remember? He spoke on that panel, leadership and defense diplomacy or something like that. He nailed it. The photos came out great. He fit right in with the upper brass. That blazer. Wow. He looked like a senator. I stared at the wall, the sound of the industrial dryer thumping behind me. You used the money I sent. For his suit. There was a pause. The first hesitation I'd heard in months. Well, he needed to look the part, Cassie. These opportunities don't come around twice. He was representing the family, and it all worked out, so I hung up. No yelling, no drama. Just the sharp, clean snap of a connection ending. I stood in the fluorescent hallway and felt something in me shrink, then settle, like a snapped rope finally going still. I had eaten ramen and skipped heat to wire money home. I had passed on vacations, declined beers, rationed toothpaste, and bought boots secondhand. Also, Gregory could stand in a rented ballroom drink, sparkling water from stemmed glasses, and smile into flashbulbs paid for by the sister who was always too much. Too intense, too invisible. That night, I didn't cry. I wrote an email to my bank. Automatic payments canceled. Future wires disabled. No explanation. Just silence. 3 weeks later, the phone rang again. This time, it was my father. His voice was firm, clipped. Cassandra. Since when did you become selfish? I didn't answer. You cut off support to your own family, he snapped. Do you think you're too good for us now? I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear, staring at it like a foreign object. Then I brought it back. I'm just learning from the best, sir. And I hung up. That was the first boundary. It wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was restraint. A quiet, strategic decision built not from bitterness, but clarity. No more giving to people who only knew how to take. No more waiting for thanks that never came. From that moment on, I stopped asking what they needed and started asking what I deserved. It's strange how silence can feel louder than shouting. After I cut the payments, my phone stayed quiet. No missed calls, no guilt-laced voicemails, not even a passive-aggressive text from my mother asking if I was doing okay. It was as if the money had been the only thread holding our relationship together, and once that snapped, there was nothing left to discuss. At first, I checked my phone constantly, half expecting someone to say something, anything. But the silence just stretched, and eventually I stopped checking. Instead, I started doing something radical. I spent money on myself. Not luxury, not indulgence, just dignity. A mattress that didn't sag in the middle. A winter coat rated for sub-zero instead of thrift store nylon. Real toothpaste. The kind with mint that doesn't taste like chalk. I took a long weekend with 2 teammates and rented a tiny cabin up in the Rockies. We grilled cheap burgers over a fire pit passed around a 6-pack and told the kind of stories that only make sense when you've spent months pretending not to be exhausted. I laughed so hard I forgot I had ever cried over a bank transfer. I didn't tell anyone at home. They wouldn't have cared. They never asked how I was sleeping, never wondered if I had food, never once checked if I was okay. Their concern only showed up when the deposits stopped. And that I realized was their version of love, conditional, silent, and entirely one way. Back at base, I threw myself into my work. If affection wasn't an option, then mastery would have to do. I was promoted to intelligence liaison for an overseas unit in less than 2 years. My commanding officer, a stoic colonel named Barrett, once called me the cleanest set of eyes we've got. That was as close to a compliment as I'd ever need. I started briefing senior officers, mostly men in their 50s with thinning hair and thick resumes, who didn't know what to do with a woman who didn't apologize before speaking. But over time, they stopped looking at my age or gender. They started reading my reports instead. I didn't think about my family much during that period, but there were moments, brief and unwelcome, where memory clawed back in. Like the time I passed a young soldier sitting alone outside the mess hall. Head bowed, hands clenched. I stopped. Sat beside him without asking. He said nothing. Just handed me a photo, his brother, freshly enlisted, already killed in a training accident. I didn't say I'm sorry. I didn't need to. I just sat with him in the quiet because sometimes company means more than comfort. That night I dug out the one photo I still had of me and Gregory. We were kids, maybe 10 and 14. He had an ice cream cone. I had a skinned knee. We both smiled at the camera like we didn't know how the rest of it would play out. I tore the photo in half, not from rage, from relief. The next day, my inbox chimed with an encrypted request from a name I hadn't seen in years. Colonel Eva Marston. I'd met her once briefly during a rotation at Fort Belvoir. She had sharp eyes and a reputation for tearing apart junior officers who thought they were smarter than the system. I respected her before I even knew her. Her message was short. Knox. You still think 3 moves ahead? I need someone who doesn't flinch. Report to Langley. 0600 Monday. No excuses. I didn't hesitate. That Sunday I packed everything into one duffel bag and left behind the photo halves, the mattress, the piece I'd found in the Rockies. I wasn't done fighting, not yet. I just needed a battlefield that deserved me. At Langley, the assignments changed. No more surface-level missions. This was high-level strategy now: AI protocols, counterintelligence simulations, foreign threat modeling. The room was colder, quieter, more elite. And I belonged in it. For the first time in my life, no one asked where I was from. They only asked what I saw that others didn't. And I gave them answers, not to earn love, but to prove I'd never needed theirs to begin with. Afghanistan wasn't on the original assignment list, but strategy isn't built in air-conditioned offices. It's forged where boots sink into dirt, where decisions ripple outward through dust and static. So when Colonel Marston called me into her office and asked, "You still believe in what can't be measured on a graph?" I said yes. 3 weeks later, I was wheels down in Kunar province, where the sky pressed low and the hillsides looked like they were carved from ash. We were stationed in the Korangal Valley. Soldiers called it the Valley of Death. The nickname wasn't dramatic, it was historical. This place didn't just swallow men, it devoured certainty. I was assigned to a multinational intelligence cell, tasked with mapping rogue AI supply lines, tech shipments that were falling off the grid and reappearing inside enemy networks. We tracked fragments of code, like footprints in the snow. Every click a whisper, every ping a potential ambush. That's where I met Sergeant Elijah Mercer. He wasn't polished. He didn't salute too sharply or quote manuals, but he moved like someone who'd memorized the difference between fear and caution. Our first real conversation happened during a blackout. I was at the comms tent recalibrating field data when the power cut. No warning. Just silence and the sudden weight of darkness. I didn't flinch, just reached for my backup flashlight. "You always that calm," a voice said behind me. I turned. Mercer stood there holding a crate of batteries. He set them down and started helping without asking. "Calm's just what fear looks like when it's got a checklist," I replied. He snorted. "Guess I'm overdue for some organization then." We didn't talk much after that. We didn't have to. The valley taught you who was real faster than words ever could. 2 weeks later, everything cracked. It was a routine patrol. Our drone feed caught movement along a ridgeline. The terrain was jagged, visibility thin. I flagged it as probable decoy behavior. Mercer's unit moved in anyway. Standard protocol required boots to confirm. Then the ambush triggered. Gunfire erupted like a lightning storm, erratic, echoing off the cliffs. I was in the forward intel station when the radio flared. "We've got a man down. Mercer's hit. Can't reach him, he's pinned behind the south boulder. Requesting fallback." The voice shook. I didn't blame them. Command called for full extraction. But I saw the coordinates. I knew the terrain. I saw the pattern and the timing. It wasn't just a trap. It was bait. I grabbed my gear and moved before they could finish arguing protocol. By the time I reached the outer perimeter, 2 soldiers were already suited to assist. No questions. They just followed my lead. We crawled through dust and thunder. The air stank of metal and adrenaline. When I saw Mercer, blood soaking through his thigh bandage, rifle still clutched, I locked eyes with him. He didn't plead. He just waited. We dragged him out inch by inch, covering fire, snapping around us like breaking bones. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. It felt like a year. In the field tent that night, he was doped on morphine, drifting in and out. I sat next to him in silence. He reached into his flak vest and pulled out a smashed chocolate bar, half melted, probably stale. He broke it in 2 and handed me the bigger piece. "Didn't leave me behind," he mumbled. "No," I said. "I didn't." "Not everyone would have come back," he added. I looked at the chocolate in my hand. "Not everyone's family," I said quietly. He smiled before sleep took him. That night I stood outside the tent and stared at the stars, the ones no dust storm could fully hide. Back in Illinois, I had siblings in blood. But out here under the black Afghan sky, I found something deeper. Not heritage, not obligation, but loyalty chosen. And that made all the difference. It happened on a Wednesday morning. I had just come off a 16-hour stretch reviewing intercept reports and geospatial heat maps, bleary-eyed and neck stiff from crouching over outdated hardware. The base mess had run out of real coffee, so I was sipping the powdered kind, burnt bitter and barely hot. I was halfway through recalibrating a signal drift algorithm when someone shouted from the rec room. "Knox, you need to see this." I didn't move at first. I'd heard that tone before, half disbelief, half adrenaline. But it usually meant someone's ex had gotten arrested or an NFL player said something political. Then came the second voice. Low, flat, urgent. "Cassandra, you'll want to sit down." That made me stand. Inside the room, 6 soldiers were clustered around the TV. The signal flickered the audio too loud. A banner scrolled across the bottom, special feature, the young minds behind Operation Sentinel. I stopped cold. The anchor introduced the guest, Lucas Harwood, my cousin. He was seated stiffly in a dress uniform that fit like a rental posture textbook expression composed. One of the architects of the groundbreaking Operation Sentinel. The host said, her voice reverent. "Can you walk us through that pivotal night?" I blinked. He smiled modestly. It was chaos. We were losing ground fast. Drones offline, terrain impossible. But I had studied the valley map extensively. I knew the pressure points. He leaned in, voice lowered like he was sharing a secret. I made the call to flank. It was risky, but it worked. The soldiers beside me murmured. Someone said, "Wait, that's not." I didn't speak. I couldn't. Because everything he was describing, the intel gaps, the drone failures, the terrain analysis came from my notes, my map, my decisions, word for word. I knew because I'd briefed them myself in a closed session 4 weeks earlier. Lucas wasn't even stationed in the region. He'd been in Germany working on an unrelated logistics task force. He hadn't stepped foot in the Korengal, hadn't heard the gunfire crack. The ridgelines hadn't dragged Mercer's limp body out of the dirt, while rounds popped inches from his skull. But there he was, on national television, retelling my war story like it was his. The camera zoomed slightly as Lucas choked up. "We lost good men, but we held, because we refused to leave anyone behind." A single tear rolled down his cheek, scripted. Perfect, not a moment too long. My hand clenched around the styrofoam coffee cup until it buckled. Behind me, the room went quiet. Not out of respect, out of confusion. They knew me, they knew I was there, but they didn't know how to ask the question now hanging in the air. "Why is someone else getting credit for your war?" I turned and walked out. Outside, the sun had risen, but the air still smelled like gun oil and stale bread. Dust clung to everything. It never really left. It just waited to settle. I made it halfway to the operations tent before I stopped. Not because I was overwhelmed, because I was calculating. I had stayed silent through enough slights to last a lifetime. But this wasn't just family politics. This was erasure, institutional, public, broadcast to millions, by someone who didn't earn it, by someone who didn't bleed for it, by someone who used my work as a stepping stone. That afternoon, I stepped into the comms tent and asked for encrypted line access. The tech on duty looked up surprised. "Priority line, ma'am." "Yes," I said, to who I gave him the number. He nodded. It rang twice before connecting. A voice answered low, amused. "I was wondering when you'd call, General." "Spectre." I said, my voice level. "I need you to find a ghost. Name Lucas Harwood." And whoever helped him. There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. "Target acquired." "What's the plan?" he asked. I looked out the tent flap back toward the ridgeline, where silence and sacrifice still lived. "We expose them," I said. "Everything, every thread, every lie. Copy that." I didn't hang up right away, because the war wasn't over. It had just changed location. This wasn't a battlefield of bullets anymore. This was a battlefield of truth, and I had finally decided to fire back. The first person I called wasn't my cousin. It was my father. He picked up after one ring. "Cassandra," he said, like we hadn't gone months without speaking. Like I hadn't stopped wiring him money. Like my name still meant something warm to him. "You saw the interview," I said, no inflection. "Of course," he replied, sounding almost pleased. "Lucas did well, polished, confident. The country needs more young men like that." The line buzzed faintly between us. Wind, or maybe something in me fracturing. "That was my operation," I said. He took my work, my field reports, my maps. He's never even set foot in that valley. My father exhaled slowly, like he'd been waiting for this call. Look, he needed a boost. It helps the family image. You're already a general, what's the harm in sharing the spotlight a little? It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. He knew. He had authorized it. You gave him permission to lie. I gave him permission to represent us, he corrected, as if semantics would save him. And don't make this about ego, Cassandra. That's not who we raised you to be. Something inside me curled inward. Ego. That's what he called it. The theft. The betrayal. The rebranding of my sacrifice as someone else's story. I'm not doing this with you, I said. Calm as glass. You're being selfish, he snapped. You always, I hung up. I stared at the wall of the secure intel tent for a full minute, breathing through the static in my chest. The sense of drowning not in water, but in a flood of deliberate forgetting. My family hadn't just looked the other way. They'd handed over my life's work like a spare coat. Because in their eyes, I was never the brand. Gregory had the polish. Lucas had the likability. I had the results, but not the presentation. And in their world, truth without packaging was inconvenient. I walked outside. The Afghan wind bit at my face dry and unrelenting. I let it strip the heat from my skin, let it cool what fury couldn't fix. Back in the bunker, Spectre had already pulled metadata from the televised interview. He gestured me over to the screen. Take a look, he said, tapping the keyboard. This is the pre-show briefing packet sent to Lucas by a Pentagon liaison. It includes talking points. Half of them are lifted directly from your classified Sentinel report. My throat tightened. How did he get access, I asked. That's the interesting part, Spectre replied. He didn't. Someone else sent it to him. He clicked again, revealing the email header from gstoneayado.mil. Subject: re-narrative support for Operation Sentinel Attachment, Cass Knox, Ops. Brief 23/7 in Tots PDF. Gregory, my brother, the same one who always got the steak dinner. The one who wore Armani to my sacrifice. The one who once warned me not to trip on stage. He hadn't just helped Lucas. He'd built the entire lie. And he'd used my own damn file to do it. I sat down slowly, the air thick with revelation. They hadn't just forgotten me. They had rewritten me. Spectre didn't speak. He just handed me a USB drive, encrypted and labeled with the word root. There's more, he said. Give me 48 hours. That night, I didn't sleep. I read every word of the briefing Greg had packaged. Every phrase he had tailored. He had even changed my mission timestamps to make Lucas appear in the right place at the right time. He scrubbed my name, inserted his cousin's added quotes in a voice I didn't recognize, but could tell were meant to sound military. And the worst part, he did it well. I knew how the media worked. I'd seen enough soldiers turned into caricatures, but I never thought the caricature would be built from my bones. I thought of Mercer still in rehab back in Germany, the scar on his leg, the blood on my hands, the chocolate bar he broke in half. Would Lucas ever sit in a field tent with real dirt on his boots? Would he know what it was like to feel a man's pulse fading under your grip? No. But he would smile for cameras, and the world would believe it, because the world believes what it's told, unless someone tells it something truer. I opened my laptop and started writing. Not a journal, not a resignation. A record of what happened, and of what would happen next. Langley taught me to weaponize information, but Afghanistan taught me when to aim. I spent the next 2 days off the grid, sleeping in shifts, living off MREs and black instant coffee while Spectre cracked digital vaults. We weren't just tracing one leak anymore. We were unraveling a web intentional, precise, and deeper than I'd thought possible. Every breadcrumb led to another name, another file, another coordinated decision to erase. I didn't cry, didn't pace, didn't scream. Instead, I compiled time-stamped briefings, field logs signed with my digital key, geotrack pings from my SATCOM devices during the Korangal mission, a full transcript of the Sentinel operation, my voice giving orders relayed back from 3 channels. All of it, not for revenge, but for clarity. And still I hesitated, because silence for me had become armor. Every insult, every dismissal, every memory of standing alone in a crowd of family who saw through me, I'd turned it into endurance, into rank, into discipline. But silence is a gamble. It only works if the people around you care enough to fill in the truth. Mine didn't, and now my silence had been used against me. Spectre found the nail in the coffin on the evening of the second day. He didn't knock when he entered, just tossed a flash drive onto my table. Consinity Protocol, he said flatly. What's that internal directive? Written by General Adrian Connors. Ties together your security review with a backdoor clause allowing outside narrative adjustments for media stability. He sat down, rubbed his temples. You weren't just sidelined, you were rebranded. On purpose. For optics. I clicked the file open. There it was. My name stripped of rank, marked for public de-escalation. The reason: volatile under pressure, resistant to hierarchy, poor alignment with family-facing PR strategies. Not a tactical failure, not a legal violation, just inconvenient. I closed the laptop. Spectre leaned back. You know what, this is right. Yeah, I said, it's war. We didn't say anything for a long time. Then from the doorway behind us, a voice broke the silence. You're not going to let this slide, are you, Colonel Eva Marston? She stepped into the room like she already knew the answer. I let them call me a burden, I said. I let them take my money, my work, my name. I let them silence me because I thought it was stronger to stay quiet. I stood. But this isn't silence anymore. This is surrender. She crossed her arms, nodded once. Then don't surrender. Burn it down. That night we started outlining the release strategy. Not a media circus, not a whistleblower leak, a controlled detonation. Phase 1 dossier prep. Every log cross-verified. Phase 2, secure contact with investigative journalists not tied to DoD channels. Phase 3, Senate Oversight Committee scheduling a formal testimony request, backed by Marston and 2 other generals who owed me more than favors. I worked through the night. At 0300, Spectre pushed a sealed package across the table. Harwood just updated his personal press kit, he said. Includes a speech excerpt. Want to guess who it sounds like? I didn't need to guess. I printed it out anyway, read every word. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out a pen and signed my name across the page in bold, sharp ink. Claimed. Because silence is not peace. Peace is earned. And it starts when you decide to stop making yourself smaller just so others feel bigger. At sunrise, I stepped outside the tent. The horizon over Kunar was jagged, gold-edged, and infinite. I stood alone, the wind tugging at my jacket. Behind me, soldiers were waking. Gear was clinking. The world moved forward. But inside me, something held still. Not pain, not fear, a vow. The next time they heard my name, there'd be no confusion who it belonged to. Her name was Leah Mercer. Sergeant Elia Mercer's younger sister. We met at a roadside diner just outside Arlington, Virginia. Vinyl booths, stale coffee, and the kind of quiet that made it safe to speak truths too sharp for email. She'd reached out through an encrypted contact line we'd buried inside a veterans resource forum. Said she was a freelance investigative journalist, now working on military accountability cases. Said she had something I'd want to see. Leah looked nothing like Elia. Where he was weathered and blunt, she was meticulous, words chosen like moves on a chessboard. But her eyes carried the same thing, a refusal to look away. I started digging after what happened to Elia, she said, flipping open a small black notebook. Your name never showed up in the official release, just a vague mention of strategic command support. No direct credit. I nodded. That wasn't a surprise. She slid a small voice recorder across the table. I've been tracking media manipulation trends inside the DoD press circuits. Off-the-record interviews, silent edits, anonymous sourcing. I didn't touch the recorder. She clicked play anyway. My brother's voice, polished, smooth, detached. She's got metals, sure, but don't confuse luck for talent. The real skill is knowing how to shape the narrative. The air left my lungs in a single sharp breath. Leah paused the recording. He was talking to a group of defense journalists. I verified the timestamp and location. Private lunch, unlisted guest list 2 days before your cousin's Fox interview aired. I said nothing. She opened a folder. Inside, a printout of email exchanges. Gregory Stone's address was everywhere. Subject lines like narrative cohesion, media prep, and advanced talking points for Harwood. Each thread matched a subsequent story. Some quoted unnamed Pentagon insiders. Others framed Lucas as a rising tactical star. All of them erased me. One line was underlined in red ink. This helps balance her visibility. I felt my knuckles go white on the tabletop. Balance her visibility, like my presence was a math problem. like credit was a risk to be managed, not a truth to be respected. Leah pushed another paper toward me, a metadata log of uploaded press materials from an internal DoD server uploaded under Gregory's clearance. The files matched the content of Lucas's press packet. He didn't just help Lucas, Leah said. He orchestrated the entire campaign, narrative, quotes, images, placement. I stared at the documents. They looked official, clean, impersonal, surgical even, but I knew what they really were, a heist in plain sight. I closed the folder, looked at Leah. Why bring this to me? She hesitated only briefly. Because Elijah doesn't talk much. But when he says someone saved his life, I believe him. And when he says that same person's being cut out of her own story, I don't sit still. I reached across the table and took the flash drive. This is going to get loud, I warned. She smiled. Then we better make it worth the noise. Back at the Arlington safe house, Spectre was already reviewing server breach maps when I walked in. I dropped the folder in front of him. He flipped it open, whistled low. Damn, he muttered. Your brother's sloppy, arrogant, but sloppy. He turned the monitor toward me. You recognize this email address I did? Too well. 8jackson@knoxogmail.com, my father's. Unsecured, unencrypted. Used like he'd never imagined someone would check. Spectre clicked it open. An email chain between my father and General Connors. Subject line, behavioral patterns, Cassandra. I sat down. The body of the email was cold, analytical, written like a case file. Cassandra has always demonstrated volatility under pressure. She displays resistance to male authority and an idealistic rigidity that may compromise long-term leadership viability. My own father had authored the psychological profile that justified my erasure. He hadn't needed to fabricate evidence. He'd simply handed over my worst traits, stripped of context, sharpened into weapons, and called it concern. Spectre didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I stared at the screen, then leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. So this was the circle. Father, brother, cousin, general. Each one with a scalpel. Each one believing I wouldn't cut back. But they misunderstood something fundamental. I hadn't survived war zones just to surrender in boardrooms. And if they thought burning my name would make me vanish, they'd forgotten what happens when fire meets steel. You don't fight a war like this with bullets. You fight it with precision, timing, and silence sharp enough to wound. I spent the next 72 hours building a playbook, not out of pride, but out of necessity. Every mission I'd led had started with two questions. What do they expect me to do? And what happens if I do the opposite? This would be no different. Spectre ran security sweeps every 3 hours. Eva Marston secured me back-channel clearance to internal Senate scheduling. Leah Mercer began vetting journalists, ones who wouldn't flinch when the story got ugly. We weren't rushing, we were fortifying. Because if I'd learned anything from being discarded, it was this: you don't get a second chance to speak the truth. Not and be believed. So you make it count. We called it Phase 0 containment before detonation. No leaks, no press drops. No anonymous sources familiar with the matter, just silence and a storm brewing underneath. The evidence spoke for itself. Debrief logs with my voice issuing commands. Chain of command emails routed through secure DoD servers. Time-coded drone footage, exact mission overlays, SATCOM sync timestamps, all irrefutable. But the real weapon wasn't data. It was pattern. Because once you line up the timelines, my suspension, Lucas's media debut, Gregory's file, uploads my father's psychological profile, sent to General Connors, it stops looking like a coincidence. And starts looking like a strategy, a systemic one. By the 5th night, I had a full operations binder. Eva reviewed it with a soldier's eye. No flinching, no comment until she reached the final page, the list of targeted correction points and demand for a full Senate Oversight Committee hearing. She tapped it with her pen. Do you want reinstatement, no promotion? I shook my head. I want the rot exposed. On the record. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You know this means war. I met her gaze. I didn't start it. She nodded. But you're going to finish it. We set the date for the hearing, 2 weeks out. Enough time to notify witnesses, to trigger public records protocols, to ensure it couldn't be buried. Spectre scrubbed every trace of our prep trail. Leah drafted her pre-report not for publication but for legal timestamp. Every move was double-blind encrypted, mirrored across multiple drives. And through it all, I didn't flinch. Because I knew now this wasn't just about me. It never had been. It was about the next Cassandra, the next soldier told to smile and shrink, the next strategist who got rewritten in real time because someone else played golf with a senator. This was about pattern interruption, about consequence. And somewhere beneath all the data and steel nerves was something more dangerous than revenge: conviction. The night before our internal submission was due, I stood at the whiteboard in the bunker. Red lines mapped names, connections, timestamps. Gregory's voice echoed from the recording Leah had given me, still replaying in the corner speaker. Don't confuse luck for talent. The real skill is knowing how to shape the narrative. I picked up a marker, wrote one word beneath his name, narrative. Then I wrote mine, proof. The contrast was stark and irreversible. That night I slept for 6 uninterrupted hours for the first time in weeks. Because phase 1 would begin at dawn. And when the truth finally spoke, it wouldn't whisper. It would detonate. The hearing room smelled like old carpet and nervous ambition. Capitol Hill, Senate Armed Services Committee, row after row of polished shoes, press suits and faces trained in performance. Cameras were already rolling C-SPAN local affiliates, one military live stream. The seal of the United States glinted behind the committee table, stoic and ceremonial. I stood in the hallway for 12 seconds before they called my name. General Cassandra Knox, the floor is yours. I walked in straight-backed ceremonial blues pressed to razor lines. I didn't smile, didn't wave. I took my seat at the center table and placed a single manila folder in front of me. Inside was nothing flashy, just truth. Senator Harlan, chair of the committee, gave the standard preamble. General Knox, you have requested to speak under oath regarding allegations of misconduct, misattributed commendations, and the use of psychological assessments in personnel suppression. Do you confirm the statement you submitted is your full and honest account? I do. I adjusted the mic. For 15 years, I served this country without asking for credit. I led missions in silence. I planned in shadows. I accepted the cost of the uniform without expecting applause. A pause. But recently, my silence was mistaken for surrender. And now I intend to correct the record. I clicked the remote in my hand. Behind me, the first slide lit the room, a video still of Lucas Harwood on national television recounting Operation Sentinel. I clicked again. Now side by side appeared the black box transcript, my voice giving commands under fire. The audio followed. Delta Team shift left. Cover fire on Second Ridge. Do not fall back, we retrieve Mercer. Lucas's televised version had described the same moment, but he wasn't there. I turned back to the room. Lucas Harwood was not present for Operation Sentinel. He did not issue commands. He did not witness the events. The words he spoke on television were lifted directly from my official mission report. A low murmur swept through the room. I clicked again, this time emails, metadata, PDF briefings uploaded from Gregory Stone's Department of Defense login preparing Lucas for his press appearances. Then came the voice recording. Gregory, smooth and calculated. She's got medals, sure, but don't confuse luck for talent. The real skill is knowing how to shape the narrative. Not a quote from a rival. A quote from my own brother. I paused. Let the weight of that settle. Gregory Stone used internal files to orchestrate a campaign of misattribution. He knew what he was doing, and he did it with support. Next slide, my father's email. Behavioral patterns, Cassandra. I didn't read it aloud. I didn't have to. I just let the words glow behind me, words written by the man who raised me, handed to the general who approved my suspension. He didn't report me. He didn't accuse me of wrongdoing. He simply handed over just enough of my flaws to let someone else weaponize them. I turned back to the senators. This wasn't a mistake. It was a playbook. And I wasn't the first name in it. Silence blanketed the room. Senator Harlan leaned forward, voice quieter now. Are you saying your suspension was retaliation? I'm saying it was theater. A ripple of gasps. The press row leaned in. The air changed. And they forgot who taught drama in this war. I looked directly at General Connors seated behind the committee with his legal advisor. His jaw was locked, his knuckles white against the chair. You authorized the declassification of briefing packets tied to my mission, I said. You funneled those files into a narrative structure that suited your public image goals. And you sanctioned my suppression, not because I posed a threat to security, but because I posed a threat to your storyline. He didn't respond. I hadn't expected him to. I turned to Gregory, seated one row back, no uniform, no expression. Just a tight-lipped figure in a designer suit, caught for the first time without his mask. You told the world I was too cold to be followed, I said. But I didn't drag anyone into this with lies. I led with truth, and people followed anyway. The committee chair cleared his throat. This chamber will recess into executive review. General Knox, thank you for your testimony. I stood, gathered my folder, and walked out of the room without looking back. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was respect, and it had taken me 15 years to earn. I didn't go home after the hearing. I walked instead past the Capitol steps, past the security barricades and protest signs, past the row of journalists yelling my name like they just learned it had weight. I ignored them all. My gloves stayed in my pocket, my uniform collar undone by the wind. When I reached the reflecting pool, I stopped. The water was still, glassy, like it didn't dare move in the presence of everything that had just cracked open. I stared at my reflection for a long time. It didn't feel like recognition. It felt like acknowledgement. Behind me, someone approached. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. Eva Marston stood there in civilian clothes holding 2 coffees. She didn't say a word, just handed me one and stood beside me in silence. We didn't toast. We didn't debrief. We just stood. Because some wars don't end in victory. They end in release. That night back at the safe house in Arlington, Spectre slid a flash drive across the table. It's done, he said. Press picked up the story. It's trending in under 12 minutes. Lucas wiped his socials. I didn't smile, not out of restraint, but because justice isn't joy. It's relief. I sat down at the old table where we'd started the operation weeks ago. The maps were gone now, the screens dimmed, but the air still carried the residue of purpose. Leah Mercer was already drafting the follow-up piece. She looked up once and said, "You know what they're calling you?" I raised an eyebrow. "The General of Truth." I shook my head. "That's dangerous." "No," she replied. "That's overdue." Later that evening, a call came through a secure line. "The President's Chief of Staff, General Knox," he said. "The President would like to extend a formal promotion and a new post at the White House Senior Strategic Advisor. Effective immediately." I let the silence linger. "Then I'm honored, but I'm not interested in a new rank." He paused. "Then what do you want?" I looked around the room at the empty chair where Spectre had once sat, at the plain file folder still marked Phase 2. "I want to rebuild on my terms," I said. Another pause. "Then we respect that." That night I stood outside on the balcony. The lights of Washington flickered below, like a city exhaling. The wind carried no orders, no ghosts, no weight. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the old key to the Knox family farmhouse, the one my father had given me when I was 16, along with a lecture about legacy. I held it for a long moment. Then I dropped it into the Potomac. It hit the surface with a whisper. Gone. Not buried. Returned. I bought the land 6 weeks later. A quiet stretch on the edge of the Blue Ridge foothills, 2 hours outside D.C., where the tree line swallowed noise and the ground didn't care about rank. 37 acres of hardwood and open sky. No gate, no plaques, just space. I didn't name it after myself. I named it the Marston Institute. Not out of sentiment, but because Ava was the first person who saw strategy in me before anyone else did. She protested, of course. I ignored her. The mission was simple: build a place where leadership meant accountability, not image. We didn't take politicians, we didn't take glory hunters. We took veteran civilians, officers in burnout, enlisted with bruised clarity. Anyone who had ever tasted disillusionment and still wanted to do good anyway. We taught ethics in warfare, tactical integrity, strategic resilience, how to make decisions without losing yourself. Some days were easy, others not. I'd find myself standing outside the converted barn we used as a lecture hall, watching new cadets arrive with that tightness in their jaw, the kind that said, "I've seen too much and still wasn't enough." I knew the feeling. One overcast morning, I was clearing out the garden beds when I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. I didn't turn, not right away. Then Cass, my mother's voice. I froze. When I looked up, she stood at the edge of the walkway in her old brown boots, Not manicured, not dressed for show. Just present. She walked toward me, crouched, and without a word picked up the small gardening trowel I'd set aside. We worked in silence. It wasn't forced, it was willing. When the last bed was cleared, she reached into her coat pocket and placed something in my palm. My first marathon medal. The one I thought they'd thrown out years ago. The ribbon was polished, the metal smooth. She didn't explain how it had survived. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I wasn't brave. I didn't say anything. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't need to. I just nodded once, closed my fingers around the medal, and set it carefully on the work table like it mattered. That afternoon I led a seminar on mission collapse recovery. Half the class were veterans, the other half NGO responders. One woman asked, "How do you lead when no one follows?" I looked at the room full of worn hands and stubborn hope. "You don't wait for followers," I said. "You lead anyway." Later, as the sun set behind the ridge, I walked the perimeter trail, boots muddy, air cold. The wind was clean here, unburdened. Every tree, every footstep reminded me this land was mine, not because I inherited it, but because I claimed it. And I wasn't building a monument. I was planting something that would outlast my name. Something rooted in fire, but grown from truth. It was late spring when he came. The hills behind the Institute had started to green again, the trees budding with quiet insistence. The air smelled like wet bark and clay, and the gravel along the garden paths stayed damp past noon. I was sitting on the back porch of the staff cabin, cleaning the mud from the soles of my boots with an old bristle brush, when I saw the figure walking up the road. He wasn't supposed to be here, but somehow I wasn't surprised. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he still had that wide-shouldered frame that had once made his voice sound like law, but his posture had changed. The way he moved, like every step forward, cost something. I didn't get up. I just watched as he made his way to the porch, boots crunching on stone. When he finally reached the steps, he didn't speak right away. "I wasn't sure if you'd let me get this far," he said, voice low, raspy. "I didn't stop you," I replied. He nodded like that was fair. We stood in silence for a long beat. The birds had quieted. The wind moved through the trees behind him but didn't break the tension. He took the last step up and sat down on the far edge of the porch. Same bench, same silence. Only now we weren't pretending. "I came because I wanted to say something," he said, staring out over the hills. I waited. He didn't look at me when he continued. "I thought I was protecting the family. That's what I told myself. When I pushed Greg forward. When I helped Lucas. When I let the narrative shift the way it did." My hands stilled on the boot. He was still using that word narrative like it had been inevitable, like the story told itself, and he had merely held the pen. I said nothing. "I thought it would make us stronger," he added. I turned then, met his eyes. "And when you gave Connors that profile on me, was that protection too?" He flinched. For the first time I saw it. The impact. He looked away. "That was cowardice," he said quietly. "I didn't want them to dig deeper. And I knew. If they asked you directly, you'd hold the line." "You always did." I stared at him. The man who once told me discipline was everything. The man who said crying was weakness. Who watched his daughter outshoot, outrun, outthink half her battalion, and still said Greg's got natural leadership. "You didn't just let them erase me," I said. "You handed them the blade." He nodded once. No denial. "I know." We fell into another silence. But this one was different. It wasn't absence. It was weight. I stood and walked to the edge of the porch, letting the wind hit my face. The air smelled like earth and metal. Somewhere in the distance, one of the instructors was calling cadence on a trail run. Life moved on even as the past stood unmoving behind me. I used to think I said slowly that if I worked hard enough, proved enough, gave enough, you'd see me. Not as a threat, not as an obstacle, just as yours. His voice cracked behind me. "You were always mine, Cass." I turned. "No," I said. "I was useful, I was convenient when silent, I was tolerable when invisible. But the moment I challenged your version of legacy, I became something to manage." He didn't argue, didn't shift. He just sat there, eyes glassy, jaw clenched against a grief that came too late. "I know I don't deserve to ask," he said finally. "But I wanted to give you something before I go." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small box. I didn't take it. He set it gently on the porch between us and backed away, hands open. I found it in the attic. Thought it had been thrown out, but your mother kept it. Quietly, I opened the box. Inside was a photograph, creased, slightly faded. Me, in uniform, covered in dust and sweat. My eyes sharp, jaw set. Taken right after a field op during training. And behind it, folded carefully, a letter, unopened. Postmarked 7 years ago. My own handwriting on the front. To Dad. I didn't remember writing it. But the date matched the week after I made major. I must have sent it hoping he'd respond. Hoping he'd say, well done. He never did. I looked up. I never opened it, he said. I told myself you didn't need affirmation from me anymore. You were wrong. His shoulders dropped. I know. I didn't cry. I had spent years drying every tear that wanted to fall for this man. They weren't gone. They were just reallocated. Into muscle. Into command. Into policy and boundaries and silence. But standing there, I did feel something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but fatigue. A release of the weight I'd been dragging behind me since I was old enough to understand that love in our house was rationed, awarded by merit, measured by usefulness. I picked up the letter and handed it back to him. Read it when you're ready, I said. He took it with both hands, like it was fragile or sacred. He turned to leave, made it 3 steps down the gravel path before he stopped and said, without turning around, "You didn't just survive us. You outgrew us." Then he was gone. I stayed on the porch until the wind picked up. Then I walked back inside, pulled out the Institute ledger, and added a new line to the end of our code of honor. Legacy is not passed down. It is chosen. The summer came in quiet. There were no parades, no medals, no sudden clarity. Just long mornings with black coffee and the sound of cicadas in the trees behind the main hall. The cadets rose early. They worked the trails, built shelters, argued over tactical ethics, and what it meant to lead without an audience. Some were still angry. Others carried grief like dog tags. But they showed up. They stayed. And that was enough. I didn't think about Gregory much anymore, or Lucas, or even my father. When I did, it wasn't with hate. It was with distance. Like remembering a map I no longer traveled. They lived in another orbit now, still spinning around an idea of legacy that required control, compliance, and careful erasure. I had stopped spinning with them. One afternoon, I found Elijah Mercer standing at the base of the memorial wall we'd built behind the East Trail. His cane was planted firm in the dirt, his eyes on the plaque that read, "We don't forget the weight. We carry it, together." He didn't say anything when I walked up beside him. But before he left, he pulled a patch from his jacket. Faded, edges scorched, his old unit insignia. "I want this to stay here," he said, "so the next one who walks through knows they don't have to earn a place by bleeding alone." I pressed the patch against the wood with a brass tack. It's still there now. We don't take it down when it rains. One evening near the end of August, Leah sent me a final copy of the Senate transcript, official sealed public record. I didn't open it right away. I didn't need to reread what I had lived. Instead, I opened the small leather notebook I'd carried for the last decade, once filled with op orders, supply chains, and encrypted call signs. I flipped past the pages marked with names I no longer owed anything to. On a clean sheet, I wrote, "What does a life built from truth look like? Not polished, not quiet, not handed down, built with mud, with failure, with choosing to speak when silence is easier." Some days, I still feel the old instincts stir, check for threats, run the scenario, anticipate betrayal. But out here under these trees, among these people, there is no enemy, just survivors becoming leaders, soldiers becoming teachers, people trying again. That's enough legacy for me. I'm not a burden. I never was. And I don't need anyone to carry my name forward. What I built here on this land with these hands is proof. And that's all the legacy I ever needed.